The twin suns of New Laram were setting behind the rugged mountains when the Galactic Council's delegation ships appeared on the horizon. Marcus Kane stood on the observation deck of the Colonial Administration Building, watching the sleek vessels descend through the amber-tinged atmosphere like predatory birds. Each ship bore the distinctive azure marking of the Council, a symbol that had become synonymous with bureaucratic tyranny among the outer colonies. Marcus was a man weathered by decades on this frontier world, his face marked by the harsh winds and unforgiving sun of New Laram. At 62, he carried himself with the bearing of someone who had fought for every inch of ground beneath his feet. His deep-set gray eyes held a hardness that came from watching too many good people suffer under the Council's oppressive policies. As the current elected leader of New Laram's Colonial Assembly, he had spent the last 15 years fighting for his people's right to self-determination. The planet New Laram was a world of stark contrasts. Its vast red deserts were broken by patches of stubborn green vegetation that had adapted to the thin atmosphere. The colonists had learned to work with the land rather than against it, developing innovative farming techniques and creating sustainable communities that thrived despite the challenging conditions. It was this resilience that had caught the Council's attention and their concern. Sarah Collins joined Marcus at the observation deck, her military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. As his most trusted advisor and former military colleague, she had fought alongside him during the border wars 15 years ago. Her auburn hair was streaked with premature gray, a testament to the stresses of command and the responsibility she felt toward their people. The advance team landed an hour ago. She reported, her voice carrying the crisp efficiency of her military training. Milo Vance is leading the delegation along with 3 of their top negotiators and a full diplomatic escort. Marcus nodded grimly. He knew Vance by reputation, a smooth-talking politician who had orchestrated the subjugation of 3 other frontier worlds under the guise of protection and prosperity. The man was dangerous precisely because he made oppression sound reasonable. "Any word on the treaty draft?" Marcus asked. "Dr. Elena Ferris is still analyzing it," Sarah replied. "What she's found so far isn't encouraging. The diplomatic language is carefully crafted, but the implications are clear. If we sign this, New Laram becomes a protectorate in all but name." Dr. Elena Ferris was their lead legal and scientific advisor, a brilliant woman who had left a prestigious position on Mars to join their cause. She had an unusual background combining degrees in xenopsychology, interstellar law, and political science. Her analytical mind had been invaluable in navigating the complex web of Council regulations and treaties. As if summoned by their conversation, Dr. Ferris emerged from the building's interior, a datapad clutched in her hands. Her usually neat brown hair was disheveled and her green eyes showed the strain of hours spent poring over legal documents. "I've completed my preliminary analysis," she said without preamble. "The treaty is worse than we feared. Hidden in the complex language are clauses that would give the Council direct oversight of our resources, our trade, and ultimately our governance. They're even demanding the right to station peacekeeping forces permanently on our soil." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. So, the rumors were true. They planned to strip us of everything we've built. "There's more," Dr. Ferris continued, her voice heavy with concern. "I found references to population management protocols and cultural standardization initiatives. They're not just after our resources, they want to fundamentally change who we are as a people." The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their discussion. Reed Donovan, their head of security and former military commander, approached with news of the delegation's arrival. Reed was a bear of a man standing nearly 2 meters tall with hands that could crush stones, but moved with surprising gentleness when dealing with the colonists. His left leg bore the scars of the border wars, leaving him with a slight limp that he wore as a badge of honor. "They're requesting an immediate meeting with the colonial leadership," Reed reported. "Vance seems eager to get this done quickly." "Of course he does," Marcus replied. "The faster they work, the less time we have to understand what we're signing." He turned to the group. "Let's not keep them waiting. But remember, we go in united and we give nothing away." The main conference chamber of the Colonial Administration Building was a testament to New Laram's pioneer spirit. Built from local stone and metals, it featured no luxury or ostentation, only functional beauty and solid craftsmanship. The walls were adorned with images of the colony's history. The first settlements, the agricultural achievements, the scientific discoveries that had helped them adapt to their harsh environment. When Marcus and his team entered, they found the council delegation already seated. Milo Vance stood as they approached, a gesture that seemed polite but felt condescending. He was a man in his 50s, impeccably dressed in the formal attire of the Galactic Council, with perfectly styled silver hair and a smile that never reached his eyes. "Governor Kane," Vance said, extending his hand, "it's a pleasure to finally meet face to face. I've heard so much about the remarkable work you've done here on New Laram." Marcus shook the offered hand, noting its softness, the hand of someone who had never known real labor. "Mr. Vance, welcome to our world. I trust your journey was comfortable." "Indeed it was," Vance replied, settling back into his chair. "The Council's new ships make interstellar travel quite pleasant. But enough pleasantries. I know you're as eager as we are to discuss the future of New Laram." The negotiations that followed were a carefully choreographed dance of words and implications. Vance presented the treaty as a generous offer of protection and prosperity, painting the Council as benevolent guardians who only wanted to ensure the safety and success of all human colonies. "The galaxy is becoming increasingly unstable," Vance explained, his voice carrying just the right note of concern. "Pirate attacks on the shipping lanes have increased by 40% in the last 2 years. Hostile alien species are pushing closer to human space. The Council simply wants to ensure that vital colonies like New Laram are properly protected." Dr. Ferris leaned forward. "And this protection comes with what obligations on our part?" Vance's smile didn't waver. "Merely the standard administrative oversight necessary to coordinate defensive efforts. The Council has centuries of experience in these matters." "Centuries of experience in subjugating independent worlds," Sarah muttered under her breath, earning a sharp look from one of Vance's advisors. The hours dragged on, with each side probing for weaknesses and advantages. Marcus watched it all with growing clarity. The Council wasn't interested in negotiation. They had already decided New Laram's fate. This entire process was merely a formality, a way to make their conquest seem legitimate. As the formal session ended and the delegates retired for the evening, Marcus called an emergency meeting with his inner circle. They gathered in his private office, a simple room that reflected the man himself, practical, unadorned, but filled with the weight of responsibility. "We can't sign this," he said without preamble. "You've all read the analysis. This treaty would end everything we fought to build." Reed nodded grimly. "My contacts in the security forces are ready. If this goes bad, we can give them a fight they won't forget." "It won't come to that," Sarah said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "There has to be a way to refuse without triggering a war." Dr. Ferris shook her head. "I've studied the Council's history. They don't accept refusal. If we don't sign willingly, they'll find an excuse to impose the treaty by force." Marcus moved to the window, looking out at the lights of the colony below. Each light represented a family, a dream, a life that would be forever changed if the Council succeeded. "Then we need to change the game entirely." The next morning brought an urgent message from the Council delegation. The formal signing ceremony would take place that afternoon, broadcast live to ensure transparency and legitimacy. The timing was no coincidence. It would be evening on the core worlds, prime viewing time for the galactic population. Marcus spent the morning walking through the colony, talking with the people whose lives hung in the balance. He visited the hydroponic farms where engineers had created miracle gardens in the desert. He stopped by the schools where children learned the skills they would need to thrive on a frontier world. He met with the artists and scientists who had chosen this difficult life because it offered freedom to pursue their dreams. At the last stop, an elderly woman named Eleanor Yamazaki approached him. She had been among the first settlers arriving nearly 40 years ago with nothing but determination and hope. Now she ran the colony's largest agricultural cooperative. "You look troubled, Governor," she said, her aged eyes still sharp and knowing. "We all face difficult times, Eleanor." She smiled, the expression carving deeper lines into her weathered face. "I've lived through 3 attempted council takeovers, Governor. Each time we found a way to remain free, not because we were the strongest or the smartest, but because we remembered who we are." Her words stayed with him as he returned to the administration building. The formal ceremony was set to begin in an hour, and he still hadn't decided exactly how to proceed. But Eleanor's words had crystallized something that had been forming in his mind. The main assembly hall was packed with representatives from across the colony. News crews from several major galactic networks had set up their equipment ready to broadcast the historic moment to billions of viewers. The council delegation sat at a raised platform, the treaty documents laid out on an ornate table. Vance stood to address the crowd, his voice carrying easily through the amplification system. "Citizens of New Laram, today marks a new chapter in your world's history. The Galactic Council extends its hand in friendship, offering protection, prosperity, and progress. This treaty will ensure that New Laram takes its rightful place among the great worlds of human space." Polite applause followed, though Marcus noted how forced it sounded. The people knew what was really happening here. When his turn came to speak, Marcus rose slowly. He walked to the podium, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. Behind him, the treaty documents waited, sealed and ready for his signature. Instead of heading directly to the table, he turned to face the crowd. "My fellow citizens," he began, his voice carrying across the silent hall, "we stand at a crossroads today. The choice we make will determine not just our immediate future, but the kind of people we choose to be." He paused, looking out at the faces of his people. He saw farmers and engineers, teachers and miners, artists and soldiers. He saw the diversity that made New Laram strong, the independence that made them free. 40 years ago, our ancestors came to this world. They didn't come seeking an easy life. They came seeking a free life. They carved homes from the desert, made gardens bloom in the wastelands, and built something beautiful from nothing. Vance shifted uncomfortably in his seat. This wasn't the speech he'd been expecting. "The Galactic Council tells us we need their protection, their prosperity, their guidance." Marcus's voice hardened. "But what they're really offering is subjugation. They want to turn us into just another compliant world, another source of resources to fuel their vast bureaucracy." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Vance started to rise, but Marcus continued before he could interrupt. "I've read this treaty, every word, every clause, and I can tell you that signing it would be a betrayal of everything our people have fought for. It would mean the end of the New Laram you know and love." He turned then, walking toward the treaty table. Vance smiled, thinking victory was at hand. The cameras focused on the moment, ready to capture the historic signatures. Marcus picked up the treaty documents. For a moment, he appeared to be reading them once more. Then, in a gesture that would be replayed countless times across the galaxy, he raised the papers high above his head and tore them cleanly in half. The sound of ripping paper seemed to echo through the stunned silence. Then pandemonium erupted. Delegates shouted, journalists pushed forward with their cameras, and the crowd erupted in spontaneous cheers. Vance rose, his face flushed with anger. "This is an act of war, Kane. You've just declared war on the Galactic Council." Marcus stood amid the falling pieces of paper, completely calm. "No, Mr. Vance. We've declared our independence. There's a difference." Sarah was at his side instantly, as were Reed and Dr. Ferris. They formed a protective circle around Marcus as council security personnel moved forward. The room crackled with tension as 2 groups of armed forces faced each other across the torn remnants of diplomacy. "You've made a grave mistake," Vance seethed. "The council will not tolerate this insult. You'll face the full might of our fleets. Then we'll face them on our feet as free people," Marcus replied. "Take your delegation and leave New Laram. You're no longer welcome here. The following days passed in a blur of activity. The council ships departed, but not before issuing ultimatums and threats. Within a week, long-range sensors detected the approach of a council battle fleet. Reed threw himself into defensive preparations. The colony's security forces, bolstered by a surprising number of volunteer fighters, worked around the clock to fortify key positions. They couldn't match the council's technology, but they could make any occupation costly. Dr. Ferris coordinated with sympathetic contacts on other worlds, spreading the news of New Loram's stand. To the council's dismay, several other frontier colonies began openly questioning their own treaties with the Galactic government. Sarah organized intelligence networks and guerrilla units, drawing on her experience from the border wars. She knew they couldn't win a conventional battle, but they could make the cost of conquest unbearable. As for Marcus, he found himself busier than ever, serving as diplomat strategist and inspiration all at once. He spoke to crowds of colonists, assuring them that their cause was just. He met with other colonial leaders via secure channels, building a network of resistance. Most importantly, he prepared his people for the storm that was coming. The attack came at dawn on the 15th day after the treaty ceremony. Council ships descended from orbit, like falling stars, their weapons casting deadly light across the colony's defensive positions. But instead of the quick victory they'd expected, they met fierce resistance. The colonists had prepared well. Hidden weapons emplacements opened fire from concealed positions. Improvised explosives detonated along predicted landing routes. Most importantly, the people themselves fought with a determination that surprised the council forces. When the first wave of assault troops landed in the colony's main square, they were met not by cowering civilians, but by an organized militia. The battle raged for hours, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Marcus coordinated the defense from a hardened command bunker, staying in constant communication with his field commanders. Despite the chaos of battle, he felt a strange sense of completion. This was what he had been preparing for his entire life. Governor Sarah reported over the comm, "Reed's forces have successfully held the western perimeter." Dr. Ferris reports that her teams have disabled 3 of their landing craft. "Casualties?" Marcus asked. "Lighter than expected on our side." The council troops seem unprepared for this level of resistance. This wasn't surprising. The council had grown accustomed to dealing with compliant worlds. They'd forgotten that free people fight differently than subjects. The siege continued for days. The council controlled the landing zones and parts of the colony, but they couldn't advance further without taking heavy losses. Their commanders sent increasingly urgent requests for reinforcements, warning that the simple policing action had turned into a real war. On the 12th day of fighting, something unexpected happened. A message came through on emergency channels, not from the council but from 3 other frontier worlds. They were declaring independence as well, following New Loram's example. Within hours, more messages arrived. Colonies throughout the Outer Rim were rising up their people, inspired by New Loram's defiance. What had begun as one world's refusal to surrender had sparked a revolution that threatened the Council's control of the entire frontier. The Council found itself facing a choice: commit vast resources to crushing multiple rebellions, or seek a different solution. The decision came from the highest levels of the Galactic government. 3 weeks after the first shot was fired, white flags appeared over the Council positions. A new delegation arrived, this one led by a different sort of official. A military commander with the authority to negotiate genuinely. The meeting took place in the same assembly hall where Marcus had torn up the first treaty. But this time, the dynamic was entirely different. The Council was no longer dictating terms. They were genuinely negotiating. The war had cost both sides dearly. The Council's supposedly easy victory had turned into a bloody stalemate that threatened to spread across dozens of worlds. They needed a solution that would end the fighting without appearing to surrender completely. For his part, Marcus was willing to be reasonable. He had never wanted war. He had simply refused to accept subjugation. Now, faced with the possibility of true negotiation, he was prepared to find a middle ground. The new agreement was fundamentally different from the torn treaty. It recognized New Laram and the other rebellious colonies as autonomous territories within the galactic community. They would maintain their own governments and military forces, while agreeing to trade relationships and mutual defense pacts with the Council worlds. Most importantly, the new treaty included strong protections for colonial independence. Never again would the Council be able to simply impose its will on frontier worlds through bureaucratic maneuvering. As Marcus signed the new documents, whole documents signed willingly. He thought about the long journey that had brought them to this point. The cost had been high, but the result was worth it. Later, as the Council forces prepared to depart, Vance approached Marcus for a private conversation. The diplomat looked older, his perfect composure cracked by the unexpected turn of events. "You've won," Vance said simply. "I hope it was worth the bloodshed." Marcus considered the question seriously. Freedom is always worth fighting for, Mr. Vance. The tragedy is that it came to violence at all. "You could have negotiated," Vance insisted. "There might have been another way." "There was another way," Marcus replied. "You could have offered a real treaty instead of a document of surrender. You could have treated us as equals instead of subjects." Vance had no answer to that. He left New Laram that day his political career effectively ended by his failure to secure easy compliance from what should have been a minor colonial world. In the months that followed, New Laram became a symbol throughout the galaxy. The image of Marcus tearing up that treaty was endlessly reproduced, becoming an icon of resistance against tyranny. The wounded planet began to heal its people, working together to rebuild what the war had damaged. Sarah took on a new role as Minister of Defense for the Colonial Alliance as the rebel worlds had begun calling themselves. Dr. Ferris became their chief negotiator, using her skills to help other worlds navigate the complex process of asserting their independence. Reed remained on New Laram, helping to train the next generation of defenders. As for Marcus, he continued to serve as New Laram's leader, but he also found himself thrust into a larger role as one of the founders of the Colonial Alliance. It wasn't a position he had sought, but he accepted it with the same sense of duty that had driven him to tear up that first treaty. Years later, historians would study this period as a turning point in galactic civilization. The Council's stranglehold on the frontier was broken forever, replaced by a more balanced system that respected the independence of all worlds. Trade flourished. Innovation increased, and the galaxy became a more diverse and vibrant place. But for Marcus Kane, the true victory was simpler and more personal. When he walked through the streets of New Laram's rebuilt capital, he saw children playing freely in parks, artists creating works that would never have been permitted under Council rule, and scientists pursuing research that advanced human knowledge without bureaucratic interference. The twin suns still set behind the mountains each evening, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds. But now those sunsets marked the end of another day of freedom, another day when the people of New Laram could chart their own course among the stars. On quiet evenings, Marcus would sometimes visit the monument that had been erected in the main square. It was a simple structure, made from the same local stone as their buildings, engraved with the names of those who had died defending their world's independence. At its base lay a preserved fragment of the torn treaty encased in transparent aluminum. Children would often play around the monument, their laughter echoing off the stone. They learned about the war in school, of course, but to them it was ancient history. They had been born into freedom and would grow up taking it for granted, which was exactly as it should be. Marcus would watch them play and remember Eleanor Yamazaki's words about remembering who they were. The people of New Laram were farmers and fighters, dreamers and builders. They were people who would rather die on their feet than live on their knees. As he stood there in the gathering dusk, watching the children play beneath the setting suns, Marcus knew that no treaty could ever truly capture the spirit that had driven them to fight. Freedom wasn't something that could be negotiated or granted. It was something that had to be seized and defended with every generation. The Galactic Council had learned that lesson the hard way. They had thought the colonists were bluffing, that faced with superior force, they would surely submit. They had been wrong then, and the galaxy was a freer place because of it. The evening star appeared first bright and steady in the darkening sky. Other stars followed, each representing another world, another people, another story of struggle and triumph. Some were council worlds, some were independent colonies, some were alien civilizations with their own dreams and fears. All of them shared the same sky, the same universe. But now, thanks to the actions of one man who had refused to sign away his people's freedom, that universe was a place where independence meant something more than just words on a page. Marcus smiled as he turned away from the monument, heading home to where Sarah would be waiting with dinner and plans for tomorrow's challenges. The work of building and maintaining freedom was never finished, but that was what made it worth doing. Behind him, the monument stood silent in the growing darkness, a reminder of the day when tearing up a piece of paper had torn open a new chapter in galactic history. The children had gone home to their families, but they would return tomorrow to play in the shadow of that simple stone structure, growing up free because someone had once chosen to stand up to the most powerful force in the galaxy and say, "No, we will not surrender what we have built." The stars wheeled overhead, constant and eternal witnesses to the endless human struggle for dignity and self-determination. On this small, dusty world, at the edge of known space, that struggle had taken on new meaning. The people of New Laram had proven that size didn't determine strength, that numbers didn't guarantee victory, and that the human spirit, when pushed too far, would not be contained by any treaty or law. As the night deepened and the colony settled into sleep, the ghost of that torn treaty seemed to whisper in the wind. Freedom is not negotiable. Independence is not for sale, and some things are worth any sacrifice to preserve. These were the lessons learned on New Laram, written not in words, but in actions taught not through speeches, but through struggle. The Galactic Council had thought they were dealing with simple colonists who could be easily intimidated. Instead, they had awakened something far more powerful, the collective will of people who refused to be anything less than free. And that awakening had changed everything, reverberating through the galaxy like the shockwave from a star-going nova. In the end, it had all come down to one simple act, the tearing of a paper. But sometimes in the vast complexity of galactic civilization, simple acts have the most profound consequences. The sound of that tearing paper had echoed across space and time, becoming the opening note of a new symphony of freedom that would play for generations to come. The story of New Laram became legend, passed down through the years as an example of what ordinary people could accomplish when they decided that their principles mattered more than their comfort. Children across the galaxy learned about Marcus Kane and the day he chose defiance over surrender, resistance over submission. And somewhere in the vast archives of the Galactic Council, filed away in a folder marked Lessons Learned, there was a detailed analysis of exactly how they had miscalculated so badly, how they had underestimated the power of people fighting for their homes, their families, their way of life, how they had confused compliance, born of fear, with true acceptance of authority. But the most important lesson was the simplest one. When you try to take away people's freedom, don't be surprised when they fight back. The Council had discovered this truth the hard way through blood and fire, through a rebellion that had spread like wildfire through the frontier. In the years that followed, that lesson would guide a new era of galactic politics. The age of automatic compliance was over, replaced by genuine negotiation and respect for diversity. Worlds would still join larger alliances and confederations, but they would do so as equals, not subjects. The monument on New Laram stood as a reminder of this transformation, a simple stone structure that marked the place where the old order had begun to crumble. Visitors from across the galaxy would come to see it, to understand how one man's refusal to sign his world's death warrant had helped birth a new era of freedom. And always there would be children playing in its shadow, their laughter a testament to the enduring power of hope. They would grow up knowing that freedom was not something given by governments or guaranteed by treaties, but something that had to be earned and defended by each generation. The stars continued their eternal dance overhead, indifferent to human struggles, but somehow made more beautiful by them. Each point of light in the night sky represented countless lives, countless stories of courage and cowardice, of triumph and tragedy. On New Laram, under those ancient stars, the story had begun with a choice: surrender or resist. Marcus Kane had chosen resistance, and in doing so, had chosen to make himself and his world part of something larger than themselves, a movement that would reshape the galaxy. The torn pieces of that first treaty had long since been gathered up and preserved, but their true purpose had been fulfilled in the moment of their destruction. They had served as a catalyst for change, a spark that had ignited a revolution that burned across the frontier. Years later, when peace had returned and the new order was well established, Marcus would sometimes be asked if he regretted his actions. The question always puzzled him. How could he regret standing up for his people's right to be free? How could he regret refusing to sell their souls for the promise of security? The only thing I regret, he would tell them, is that it had to come to war. But that choice was never ours to make. We didn't start the fight, we simply refused to surrender without one. And in those words lay the heart of the matter. New Laram hadn't sought conflict with the Galactic Council. They had simply wanted to be left alone to live their lives as they saw fit. When that simple desire was threatened, they had responded with the courage of their convictions. The legacy of that response would endure long after the last participants in the rebellion had passed into history. It would live on in the constitutions of free worlds, in the treaties that protected colonial rights, in the very structure of galactic civilization. But most of all, it would live on in the spirit of people who consent to accept that might made right, that size equaled power. That freedom was a privilege to be granted rather than a right to be claimed. The story of New Laram proved that sometimes, just sometimes, David really can defeat Goliath. All it takes is the courage to pick up the stone and the will to aim it true. And in a galaxy full of giants, that was a lesson worth remembering. As the monument stood quiet in the night, bearing witness to the passage of years and the changing of seasons, it served as a constant reminder of a fundamental truth. Freedom is not free, but is always worth the price paid for it. The children who played in its shadow during the day would grow up to face their own challenges, their own threats to freedom. But they would face them with the knowledge that resistance was possible, that tyranny could be defeated, that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they stood together. And somewhere in the galaxy, on other worlds facing their own dark moments, people would look to the example of New Laram and find the courage to stand up for what they believed in. The story would be told and retold, each telling, adding new layers of meaning, new inspiration for future generations. The Galactic Council had thought they were dealing with just another frontier world, another insignificant dot on their vast map of controlled territories. Instead, they had encountered something far more dangerous, the unquenchable human desire for freedom. That encounter had changed both the Council and the galaxy it governed. The easy days of automatic compliance were replaced by a more complex, but ultimately more just system of genuine partnership and mutual respect. The torn treaty had become a symbol of that transformation, a reminder that sometimes the most important victories begin with a simple act of defiance. A piece of paper torn apart in anger and principle, its fragments falling like snow on the representatives of an empire that had forgotten the difference between ruling and governing. In the end, the Galactic Council had learned a lesson that would serve them well in the centuries to come. Respect is not something that can be demanded or imposed. It must be earned. And freedom is not something that can be negotiated away in a treaty. It must be recognized as an inherent right of all peoples. The story of New Laram became part of the galactic heritage, taught in schools and remembered in songs. But its true power may be not in the retelling, but in the message it carried that ordinary people faced with extraordinary challenges can choose to be extraordinary themselves. As the stars wheeled overhead and the monument stood silent, the spirit of that message continued to inspire. Freedom was not just a word in a treaty or concept in a constitution. It was a living thing requiring constant vigilance and occasional sacrifice to maintain. The children of New Laram would learn this lesson well. They would grow up with the knowledge that their freedom had been bought with blood and sacrifice, that it was not something to be taken for granted, but they would also learn that it was something worth fighting for, something worth preserving for the generations that would follow. And so the cycle would continue each generation, teaching the next about the importance of standing up for what they believed in. The story of the torn treaty would be passed down like a precious heirloom, a reminder of the day when everything changed. But the story was far from over. It continued every day in the lives of free people, everywhere in the choices they made and the stands they took. It lived on in the laughter of children playing without fear, in the words of poets expressing forbidden thoughts, in the discoveries of scientists pursuing truth wherever it led. The Galactic Council had learned their lesson, but the universe was large and human nature was constant. There would always be those who sought to impose their will on others who mistook power for authority and control for leadership. When that day came, as it inevitably would, the people of New Laram and their allies would be ready. They had learned that freedom was not something that could be protected by treaties alone, but required eternal vigilance and the willingness to act when principles were threatened. The monument in the square would stand as a reminder and a promise that the people of New Laram had once said no to tyranny and were prepared to do so again if necessary. The torn treaty had been their declaration of independence, and that independence would be defended as long as there were people willing to stand for something larger than themselves. As the night deepened and the stars blazed overhead in their ancient patterns, the story of New Laram became part of the larger story of humanity's journey among the stars. It was a story of growth and setback, of triumph and tragedy, of the eternal struggle between those who would rule and those who would be free. But at its heart, it was a simple story about people who refused to give up what they had worked so hard to build. They had torn up a treaty because they were not willing to sign away their future for the promise of an easier present. They had chosen the hard road because it was the right road. And in that choice lay the seed of everything that followed the rebellion that spread across the frontier, the change in galactic politics, the new era of respect and cooperation. All of it traced back to that moment when one man stood before a crowd and tore up a piece of paper. The torn treaty was gone, preserved now in fragments as a historical artifact, but its spirit lived on in the hearts and minds of free people everywhere. It had become more than just a broken contract. It had become a symbol of the human capacity to choose dignity over security, freedom over comfort. As the story spread across the galaxy, it took on a life of its own. Each telling added new details, new interpretations, new lessons. But the core message remained the same. Sometimes you have to be willing to lose everything to keep what matters most. The children of New Laram would grow up knowing this truth. They would understand that their parents and grandparents had made a choice that shaped their future, that the freedom they enjoyed had been bought with courage and sacrifice. And when their own time came to choose, when they faced their own tyrannies and their own treaties that promised security at the price of freedom, they would remember the lesson of the torn paper. They would know that some prices are too high to pay, that some compromises are really surrenders in disguise. The monument would stand through the years weathered by the twin suns and the desert winds, but unbroken. It would serve as both grave marker and birth certificate, marking the death of the old order and the birth of the new. Future generations would add their own memories to its shadow, their own stories to its legacy. In the grand sweep of galactic history, the tearing of one treaty might seem like a small thing. But history is made up of such moments, individual choices, that ripple outward, changing the course of entire civilizations. The story of New Laram proved that ordinary people, faced with extraordinary circumstances, could indeed change the galaxy. The Galactic Council had thought they were offering a reasonable compromise, a way for New Laram to enjoy protection and prosperity under their benevolent rule. They had been genuinely shocked when that offer was not just rebaptized, but publicly destroyed. They had underestimated the power of symbols, the importance of dignity, the value that free people place on the right to choose their own path. They had treated the treaty as a mere formality, a piece of paperwork to be signed and filed away. Instead, it had become the focal point of everything wrong with their system: the arrogance, the assumption of superiority, the belief that all reasonable people would choose security over freedom. The dramatic destruction of that document had captured the galactic imagination in a way that 10,000 reasoned arguments could never have done. In the years that followed, treaty law would be rewritten to include stronger protections for independent worlds. Negotiation would replace dictation as the standard practice. The galaxy would become a more complex, but ultimately more just place. But all of these changes traced back to that moment in a conference room on New Laram, when Marcus Kane decided that some things were not negotiable. The simplicity of the gesture tearing paper in half contrasted sharply with the complexity of its consequences. Children across the galaxy would learn about that moment in their history classes. They would study the economic factors that led to the rebellion, the military tactics that made it successful, the political changes that followed. But the image that would stay with them was of a man standing in front of a crowd, holding up a treaty and tearing it cleanly in two. That image became a metaphor for resistance itself. The idea that sometimes you have to destroy what exists to create space for something better. It was a lesson that would resonate across cultures and species, inspiring other acts of defiance against tyranny in all its forms. The story of New Laram would be retold countless times in the years to come. Historians would analyze it, politicians would reference it, and artists would draw inspiration from it. But at its core, it remained what it had always been: a story about ordinary people who decided that their freedom was worth more than their comfort. Marcus Kane never set out to become a galactic hero or to spark a rebellion that would reshape interstellar politics. He simply refused to sign a document that would have destroyed everything his people had built. But sometimes that's all it takes to change the galaxy: one person willing to stand up and say no when everyone else expects them to say yes. The torn treaty became a symbol of hope for oppressed peoples everywhere. Its fragments, carefully preserved, would be displayed in museums and studied by scholars. But more importantly, its spirit would live on in the hearts of those who believed that freedom was worth any price. As the monument on New Laram stood sentinel through the changing years, it bore witness to the enduring truth that the human spirit, when pushed too far, will not be contained. The story it commemorated was not just about one world's fight for independence, but about the eternal struggle of the human soul to be free. And in that struggle, the image of a torn treaty would always serve as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapon against tyranny is a simple act of defiance, a refusal to cooperate, a rejection of false choices, a willingness to say that some things cannot be negotiated away. The galaxy was a vast place, full of wonders and terrors, opportunities and challenges. But it was also a place where the choices of individuals mattered, where ordinary people could shape extraordinary events. The story of New Laram proved that truth in the most dramatic way possible. As the stars continued their eternal dance overhead, the monument stood as a testament to that truth. The torn treaty was gone, but its legacy endured. It had become more than just a broken contract. It had become a symbol of the unbreakable human spirit. And somewhere in the galaxy, on worlds yet undiscovered and in times yet to come, other people would face their own moments of choice. When they did, they would remember the story of New Laram and find in it the courage to stand for what they believed in. The torn treaty had done more than just start a rebellion. It had started a legend. And legends once born have a way of inspiring reality to live up to their promise. The galaxy was a freer place because one man had once torn up a piece of paper and said, "No, we will not surrender what we have built." That simple act of defiance had echoed across the stars, proving that sometimes the smallest gestures can have the largest consequences. The story of New Loram would continue to inspire as long as there were people willing to fight for their freedom and the freedom of others. In the end, the Galactic Council had learned a hard but valuable lesson. You cannot conquer the human spirit with contracts and treaties. You cannot negotiate away people's deepest values and expect them to remain silent. And you cannot mistake temporary compliance for permanent acceptance. The torn treaty had taught them all of this and more. It had shown that true peace could only come from mutual respect and understanding, not from the imposition of one side's will upon another. It had proven that freedom was not just a political concept, but a fundamental human need. As the monument stood quiet in the gathering dusk, with the first stars appearing in the darkening sky, it served as a beacon of hope for all who looked upon it. The torn treaty was gone, but its message remained clear. Freedom is worth fighting for, and ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they stand together. The story of New Loram would endure, passed down through generations like a precious gift. It would remind future generations that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, and that sometimes that vigilance requires not just watchfulness, but action. And in the hearts of all who heard the story, the image of that torn treaty would remain a symbol of defiance, a declaration of independence, and a reminder that no treaty, no matter how carefully worded, can ever truly bind the human spirit. Some things, as Marcus Kane had proven so dramatically that day, are simply not for sale